So today we have the case against demolition. And the reason why we need to do this is because it's estimated that almost 50,000 buildings in the UK are demolished every single year. And every time a building is demolished and a new one is put in place, the resources of the existing buildings get wasted. And with extraction of new resources, there's a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions, right? So with the extraction, there's cement production alone that accounts for almost 8% of all of the world's carbon emissions. The steel industry consumes almost 50% of the construction industry almost uses 50% of the global steel production. There's almost 25% of all the plastics in that's being used across the globe for the construction industry. And in terms of looking at whole life carbon again, almost 51% or 35% of a residential building or an office building is the carbon emitted before the building's even being used, right? So construction, demolition, and excavation, all of these activities almost generate approximately 60% of UK's waste. And so it's causing ecological damage, social damage, and having economic impacts. So what we did as ACAN is to put together an online atlas of UK. And what the map does is it shows buildings that are under the threat of demolition, buildings that are already demolished, and buildings that are saved. And this is an atlas that is easy to use, is accessible to the public. And the way it works is when you click on a dot on the map, you can actually see the details of the buildings that's either been demolished or has been saved and the story behind those buildings. So basically, you're trying to record this for the future, but also stand against demolition and say what you can do about it, or listen to stories as to how people saved their buildings from being demolished as a part of the map, right? So the way the map is designed is that you go to the website and you click on add a building on top, and you select a location from on the map. It's a pin on the map. And once you choose the location, you can upload images, you can write about it, you can talk what category it belongs to, what typology, who designed it, why is it being demolished, and give all the details on it. And once you click on the save button, you get a confirmation, but it does get checked by the team on the back end. And that's when you see the building on the map going into being seen by the public. So then it's being mapped for the future. So that's how the map is designed. And today we're going to be talking to, the speakers here are going to be talking about the cases for demolition in various parts of the UK. So before that, we'd like to show you a short film on the how's Europe's demolition drama. So if I stop sharing my screen. Okay. So now we have our speakers speaking about starting with Alice. So I would like her to present her screen, but I'd like to introduce her first. So Alice is a practicing architect and an activist campaigning for action on the climate and ecological crisis in a community-led planning. So she will be talking about a demolition case in Camden. Over to you, Alice. Alice.
Hello. I'm going to talk about an area in the London Borough of Camden, near to Euston Station, with particular reference to Tolmers Square, the green oasis in the centre of this image, and a pocket of 19th century streets to the north. North Gower Street, and Drummond Street, best known for its Indian and Bangladeshi restaurants. Since 2017, this area has been devastated by the construction of High Speed 2. Streets, homes, and businesses have been demolished. The disruption is ongoing and fraught with delay and uncertainty. Since the coming of the railways in the mid-19th century, the fabric of this part of the city has been repeatedly damaged. First Euston, then King's Cross and St Pancras. This is the Midland Railway being constructed through the graveyard of St Pancras Church around 1860. To make way for High Speed 2, St James's Gardens, another graveyard, has recently been swept away entirely. Camden's Euston area plan sets out a framework for development following High Speed 2. It anticipates that additional homes and workspace, as well as replacement green space, will be provided. It was originally adopted in 2015 and is now in the process of being updated. Most of the development is focused on the station, shown in blue, with 13 redevelopment sites identified around it. The update has a number of objectives, including promoting health and well-being, helping to address climate change, and the continued success of the Knowledge Quarter. The Knowledge Quarter was launched as a concept in 2014. The initiative aims to create a hub of innovation in the area of King's Cross, Euston, and Bloomsbury. The strategy targets growth and inward investment, built on the historic association of the area with hospitals and institutions such as the Wellcome Trust and the Francis Crick Institute. It has become a dominant form of development at the expense of more affordable commercial space. These buildings under construction behind Euston St Pancras Station are financed by BlackRock and will provide 1 million square feet of life science space. They replace a substantial modern concrete frame structure that could have been repurposed. Opposite King's Cross Station, 180,000 square feet of life science space is currently being built. British Land is demolishing Euston Tower in order, in their words, to create a world-leading science, technology and innovation building. They tried to brand it as retrofit, but as only 3/4 of the lift shaft remains above ground level, that was too hard to sell. The planning application documents show that refurbishment was an option, including conversion to residential, but the requirement for extra height floors to accommodate lab-assisted office was allowed to justify demolition. Another building due to be demolished is the £13 million British Library Conservation Centre, built in 2007. It will be replaced by 600,000 square feet of lab-assisted office, due to start construction shortly at a cost of £1.1 billion. This is largely a speculative development. Even when existing buildings are retained, they are restructured for life science use with high carbon forms of construction. There is already vacant life science space being marketed in the area. So the Euston Area Plan includes a further 13 redevelopment sites, mostly predicated on demolition. This is one of them, 250 Euston Road, developed by Stuart Lipton as his first venture with Greycoat and completed in 1981. Originally built as headquarters for Prudential Insurance, it is now leased by UCLH Foundation Trust. It was apparently the first mirror-clad office building in London. It was well built and its fabric is in good condition. It has a discreet entrance on Euston Road and a parking court accessed off North Gower Street. The internal atrium provides a social space for healthcare workers. The building is of strategic importance for UCH Hospital on the opposite side of Euston Road. It is used as an education centre and for training. Office space is used by medical secretaries, clinical leads, and administrators that run outpatient clinics and inpatient surgical teams. Clinical psychologists and therapists see outpatients here. Up to 1,000 staff apparently use the building. The parking yard is important for deliveries for the wider NHS estate. The underground car park is the only parking space available for staff, including midwives. 250 Euston Road was designed by architects Renton Howard Wood Levine as part of the overall redevelopment of Tolmers Square, including social housing to the north. The office steps down from 8 stories facing Euston Road to 3 stories around the square and incorporates a pub, the Square Tavern. That's the Square Tavern. This is the sheltered housing on Hampstead Road, which is part of the scheme. The redevelopment of Tolmers Square for housing was the result of 2 decades of struggle by tenants groups, community associations, students, squatters and activists. The story is told by Nick Waits, an architectural student at the time, in his book, The Battle for Tolmers Square. Nick describes how it became a national symbol for the fight against property speculation. I'm sharing some pages from the book and the Tolmers Village Forum website with thanks and acknowledgement. Tolmers Square was built in 1863 as part of the rapid expansion of the whole area in the 19th century. It was formed by curved terraces of stuccoed houses with a church in the middle. The blight of the railways, overcrowding and increasing poverty took its toll, and the church closed in the 1920s. Converted into a cinema, it was finally demolished in 1972. The battle for Tolmers Square began in 1957 with protests against evictions, and in 1959 a campaign against office development which threatened to displace existing businesses and homes. The developer of Euston Tower, Stock Conversion Limited, started to buy properties in the Tolmers area, and by the mid-60s, Camden Council was demolishing housing deemed to be unfit and negotiating the sale of land to stock conversion. The tide began to turn in the early 70s, and the protest received a lot of support, including from students. Houses were occupied by squatters, and the Tolmers Village Association was formed in 1973. The association put on exhibitions and carnivals and created a community garden. Through continued pressure, the council eventually listened to the community, brought stock conversions land and carried out the development itself in partnership with Greycoat. This is one of the early schemes. Demolition of the existing houses was still opposed by the Tolmers Village Association, and at one point, part of the original terrace was to be incorporated into the scheme. Eventually, however, the Tolmers Square houses were all demolished. The final scheme was approved by the council in 1976. Unlike earlier schemes, it retained the whole of Drummond Street, and the original Tolmers Square became a public open space. Overlaying the current plan on the 1882 OS map shows how much of the original configuration remains, including the connection from North Gower Street to Hampstead Road. This is the Square Tavern in the summer, and this is a view from a window in 250 Euston Road. Camden's Euston Area Plan identifies 250 Euston Road for redevelopment. The 2024 consultation suggested it could become a life science space. It now suggests mixed-use residential and commercial with 115 new homes and retail. The site allocation says that a 75-metre-high residential tower at the corner of North Gower Street and Euston Road may be appropriate. The overall development height limit is 40 metres. The objective is to enhance workspace provision and provide an active frontage. This is clearly only possible through demolition and rebuilding. A nearby site allocation is the Euston Square Hotel on the opposite side of North Gower Street. This, the planners suggest, could be developed up to 40 metres high to provide a new hotel and 20 homes. This massing model, not included in the plan, is based on the heights given in the site allocations. Whatever the final detailed design, this scale of development would clearly cause harm to North Gower Street and degrade Tolmers Square. ruining it for residents and adding to current demolition disruption and pollution. Neither building needs to be demolished. This is the view of the hotel from North Gower Street. It is the last building on the line of the original Georgian Terrace on Euston Road. This indicates the impact of the scale of development encouraged by Camden in its site allocation. And this is the 75-metre high tower replacing the end of Euston Road, 250 Euston Road. Camden's indiscriminate selection of buildings for redevelopment does not consider the impact of demolition and rebuilding on the environment, despite the council having declared a climate and ecological emergency. Policies intended to prioritise retrofit and refurbishment are put aside when making site allocations, instead of being a principle guiding regeneration. Development control in Camden is similarly myopic. The planners don't seem to understand the significance of embodied carbon. In recommending for approval British Land's application for the redevelopment of Euston Tower, they placed great emphasis on the embodied carbon retained in the foundations and lift shaft. They didn't discuss or even mention the 46,000 tonnes of CO2 caused by the new construction, which is the more relevant metric and 20 times larger. The global construction industry causes 35% of current emissions. Its carbon footprint is due to double in size by 2050. This is one reason we need to stop demolition and focus instead on improving existing buildings. Just as the Euston Area Plan cannot be said to be addressing climate change, it also does not promote health and well-being, most obviously by displacing an important healthcare provider, but also due to the mental and physical stress placed on residents. The prioritisation of high-value office space threatens the stability of the city through constant rebuilding and does not enable an inclusive local economy which benefits existing communities. The ongoing loss of affordable workspace will have a negative effect on the diversity and resilience of the local economy. Finally, Camden has not involved local people in the creation of the plan. In fact, local communities have not even been told about some of these proposals. This cannot be the best way to address urban challenges or the climate and ecological emergency. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Next, we have Eva, who's a practicing architect in Scotland. Her work focuses on strategic placemaking and heritage-led regeneration, exploring how architecture can empower communities long term and create successful places both socially and environmentally. Oh, and she is going to put together the case for the demolition in Glasgow. Over to you, Eva.
Just give me a moment to connect.
And meanwhile, I'd ask all the audience if you have any questions on the video, on anything that the speakers have to say, please add that in the group chat.
Yep, hello, can you see that okay?
Yep.
I guess before I start my presentation, just to give a quick note again to provide some context on some of the things I'm going to be talking about today. I am an architect based in Glasgow, as Dipti said. I've been working here for the last 10 years. I'm originally from Greece. Since I was a student, since my academic years, I was really fascinated by the social and political aspect of architecture beyond just the individual buildings themselves, but the places and the neighborhoods that they create and that we inhabit. So I see that aspect, that kind of social and political aspect of architecture as really inseparable from the conversation generally on sustainability. And that kind of personal standpoint, I guess, underpins a lot of the themes and things I'm going to talk about today. When I was asked to talk about demolition in Glasgow, it's really, really hard to summarize in 15 minutes. Each of the examples I'm going to show today could be a case study on their own. I'll attempt a very quick historiography, a very brief description of the historical moments that really changed and reshaped Glasgow over the past kind of century. It's also really important to understand what a unique case study Glasgow is. There's a lot to cover, but I wanted to really start with this quote from Lewis Mumford from his book, The City in History in 1961. He asked at that point, will the city disappear into a vast urban hive? And I guess that was him wondering if rapid urbanization really risks our cities dissolving into this uniform urban hive and losing their character through mass regeneration. It's worth noting we are 65 years later and we are still largely asking the same questions. If we look into demolition in Glasgow, of course, it's not a new phenomenon. It's undergone repeated waves of demolition. If we start looking pre-war, the slum clearances had already started from the late 19th century up to about 1939, with by the 1930s, about 5,000 to 10,000 housing units had been demolished. During that period, demolition was largely written into policy as improvement, and it was really narrated as care rather than destruction. And of course, like in parallel with all these kind of slum clearances, there was a lot of demolition related in infrastructural and industrial needs. Glasgow was very heavy relying on industry. Industrialization caused very rapid changes in the city. I've put there an example of St. Enoch Church that was demolished to replace it with what is today St. Enoch Squares. There's so many examples like that. What that shows us is that even before the war, demolition was already embedded to how the city thought about improvement. And then going post-war, Glasgow experienced one of the most extensive urban clearances in Europe. It's quite a unique case in terms of entire districts being completely eradicated and reshaped through that mass demolition. Between 1950s and 70s, about 100,000 homes were cleared, huge slum clearances and huge numbers of population that needed to be rehoused, and you'll see in a moment how that was kind of addressed at the time. Basically, the principle of demolishing to improve our living conditions set the tone at that period for larger scale urban renewal. And what came after that was the Bruce report, and I don't know how many of you have seen that. Probably most kind of Glaswegians and the conversation have seen that. In 1945, the Glasgow city engineer at the time proposed this, which was a large-scale city-scale clearance. So essentially, a wholesale demolition of the whole Victorian and Georgian architecture of the city to replace it with this uniform, modernist dream of same-looking and same-build kind of buildings. The reason that this was not adopted was financial and political, but there was quite a lot of opposition as well because of the kind of obvious heritage reasons, and also because of the associated costs and political pressures at the time. What that plan was looking like, it was essentially, that was the plan you see on the left here. So all new buildings replacing all the existing historic urban fabric. They had actually built this mass scale model that you could go and visit. You can see that movie on YouTube, and that visitors could go and walk through that, imagine how life in Glasgow would change. That was advertised at the time as a healthy and beautiful city. And it's really, I guess, interesting to see how that reflected the social need of the time for complete renewal, fresh and new and healthy lifestyle, new build, again, achieved through demolition. And the rival proposal at the time was the new town plan, the overspill policy, that was prepared and put together by Abercrombie and Matthew, the two men that you see there in the picture. So that was the exact opposite of the Bruce report that I showed previously. So instead of looking at rehousing all the displaced people from the slum clearances in the city centre of Glasgow, it was looking at creating these new neighbourhoods, completely new build housing estate with the modernist principles of architecture around the perimeter of the city. A lot of high-rise estates were built at that period and very, very fast. Some towers were often designed, approved, and built between 2 to 5 years. Quite crazy timescales. I thought to kind of pause here and show you some of the examples that are really notable of things that were built around this time and how they look today and how they looked, how they developed. The first one I'm going to touch on is the Gorbals. It's probably the area that has most radically been reshaped in the city. Most of its urban fabric was demolished in the 60s. All the tenements that were in this area were demolished and replaced with these kind of modernist concrete blocks that you see here. The aim of that was, of course, to improve our conditions of life of the people at the time. Fast forward, most of these buildings, including the ones that you see in the pictures here, were demolished in 2004. Some of them are still standing, but essentially the Gorbals are one of Glasgow's clearest examples of repeated urban reinvention through demolition. My next example is the Red Road flats. You might have seen that these were designed in the late 50s and they were built between 1964 and 1969. This means that Glasgow delivered 8 31-story towers in just 5 years. And I think this kind of summarizes a lot of points, again, about how fast some of these projects were delivered. And that links to the political pressures of the time, but also the quality of housing that was delivered. And there's a lot of kind of ongoing debate about the problems that were simply just sifted instead of resolved. The Red Road flats were a cultural icon for the city. There's books and movies about them. You might have seen some of them. They were very much loved and very much hated, but they were a very significant culturally scheme for the city. Those were demolished between 2008 and 2015, creating a loss that is both cultural and social history for Glasgow. My last example is sadly a more recent demolition, and these are just a few examples. There's so many of these modernist estates, even like in the last few months, that are under demolition. The Windford was built in the 1960s, and it embodied some of the best principles of modernist design, some of these gardens and traffic separation, the high rises, the balconies. These were demolished last year. These 4 towers were demolished last year. That was against some very strong local opposition from a residents group, and that's basically tried to showcase with a team of architects and engineers that they could have been repurposed. There were a few alternative plans showing how this could have been materialized, and also without an environmental impact assessment, which is kind of breaking legislation slightly. So, and a pause there to note that all these examples were social housing, so you can see the kind of political and social aspect underpinning those examples. Talking about mass demolition in the name of progress and changing Glasgow entirely, how could I not mention our motorway? The M8 motorway literally cut through and divided the city in half. And this was built mainly in the 60s and 70s as part of a modernist car-centered planning proposal, a huge infrastructure project which was only being able to be realized after the demolition of hundreds of thousands of homes. This created an irreversible impact. It basically cut through the city and created this long-term physical and social severance. And you can see here the kind of map of what it looks like at the moment in the right-hand side, and the historic map on the left with an overlay of all the buildings that were lost to make that happen. To summarize what I was trying to show with these examples is the pattern that seems to be continuing in what seems to be our kind of business as usual. The business as usual still seems to be the same, and what I tried to do here is kind of summarize visually what that loop looks like. We demolish to improve our quality of life, we build new and fast, and then we neglect, we condemn, we demolish again, and that seems to be a repeated pattern of loss that runs through all the examples I talked about previously over a century. The loss here is layered, it's more than architectural, more than heritage, it's social, it's environmental, and there's a huge psychological impact as well as a societal impact, particularly related to the heritage that we lose. When we're thinking about how can we shift our mindsets and what can we change, it's not just about stopping demolition, which is of course is the first step, but it's about addressing each of those 4 circles. So reusing instead of demolition, of course, but when we build sustainably and building to last, building to take apart, potentially calculating our whole life carbon, instead of neglecting, caring, and I'll come to that in a minute, and instead of condemning, adapting, And then the most important thing of all, to stop repeating the same mistakes and just cut through these patterns and think a bit more kind of smartly, advocating for more long-lasting changes. Talking about how we care, very quickly, I wanted to touch on some threatened buildings in Glasgow. The building risk register currently has 2,214 buildings in Scotland, 143 in Glasgow. This only includes buildings that are in conservation areas, and it was last updated in 2024, I think. So these numbers are probably higher. And you can see some notable examples here. The one on the kind of right-hand side, Pollock Stables, is one the practice is working on at the moment. We're trying to bring that back to life as a public building in a public park. There's so many more examples, of course. Talking about generally legislation and policy and how we care. I don't know if you've seen that campaign. It's really a really interesting read. That's from Save Britain's Heritage. It talks about Scotland in general and about a flaw in our legislation which allows us to demolish huge architectural treasures and heritage significant buildings easier up here in the north than you do kind of down south. That closed a few days ago, and it's now under consideration to see how it could impact legislation. It's a very interesting one to look into if it interests you. To close, I will just touch on 3 very significant threatened buildings in Glasgow that I couldn't not talk about. The first one, St Vincent Street Church. This is the only survivor of 3 churches designed by Alexander Greig Thomson, a very kind of globally renowned architect from Glasgow, late 19th century, A-listed building. It was included in the World Monuments Watch blacklist of endangered historic places in 1998, 2004, and 2006, and it's still vacant. Probably the saddest story of them all in Glasgow is the MAC, as we call it, the Macintosh building, the Glasgow School of Art. Designed by Charles Ray Macintosh, early 20th century, category A listed, of course, one of the finest examples of early modern architecture, globally a famous building for its pioneering integration form, light, artistic purpose. It was burned twice, first in 2014 and then again in 2018. 7 years after its second fire, it's still in ruins. It's a building of global significance and interest, and it's worth noting here that a very similar example, Notre Dame, was burned in 2019, just a year later, and after 5 years of restoration works, it opened its doors to the public in 2024. So you can see here the kind of difference of approach to our treasures, of architectural treasures, and there's really a kind of local interest in outcry for this building to be open again. And trying to finish on a more positive note, the Egyptian halls, built again, designed by Alexander Greig Thomson, building 1870, category A, combines this classical design with Victorian commercial space. That image that you see on the left-hand side, which shows you the amazing looking facade, is an image that most Glaswegians, myself, we've never seen that live. That's because the building has been vacant for 30 years and it's covered with scaffold like the image you see on the right-hand side there. The kind of good news there and the positive news, just this month, the council announced they have selected a developer to transform it into a mixed-use development, and they are currently negotiating legal agreements to make it look, this is the image that they publicized. I guess to summarize, what I've tried to showcase here is a habit of demolition, which is embedded in our business as usual through the century and until now. The mistakes that this has caused and how we can learn from them, the cultural and psychological impact which is caused by the heritage loss and demolition for regeneration, and the urgent need to change our approach in how we demolish, build, and adapt.
Thank you, Eva. So now next we have Matt. Yeah, yeah. So we have Matt next, and he's an architectural technologist who has two decades of experience in residential and commercial design, planning, and development of adaptive reuse projects. He founded his studio RVI in 2020, and they specialize in retrofit and adaptive reuse of traditional and heritage buildings. He will be talking about a case about demolition in Croydon. And over to you, Matt.
Yep. Thank you very much, Deepti, and thank you to Eva and Alice for two very powerful presentations. So I'm going to be offering some reflections on Croydon and going to explore and offer some provocations on the effects of demolition. Is my screen sharing yet? No, 1 second.
Yes.
Hopefully that's working, good. And hopefully I'm going to finish with a bit of an optimistic note, but we'll see where we get to. So my story starts in 2015 with attempting to rescue Kelston Lodge in Folkestone Conservation Area. And we proposed the demolition of a 1980s 5,000 square foot extension added to the original 1918 house when it became an NHS care home. And during a frustrating planning process, the proposal split opinion in the planning department, not for the reasons you might be expecting. The proposal was supported by one officer, yet there was another who was adamant that the entire 11,000 square feet, including the original house, should be demolished and replaced with a prominent block of flats. Planning policies, administration, and personnel appeared to be an absolute chaos. Thankfully, 3 years later, if my slides are working, Kelston Lodge was saved and back in use. But it gave me a real insight into how these careless attitudes can quickly embed themselves into the systems that shape our built environment, how fragile the structures of policy, bureaucracy, and leadership sometimes appear to be. In the most extreme examples of rampant demolition, the fabric of civic society can be dramatically unraveled with sometimes bewildering speed. Often there's financial opportunism as the motivation and short-term policy making as the facilitator. In a recent essay titled Uncanny Places, the psychologist Lucy Huskinson explores cognition and perception of the built environment. And she recalls the theories of sociologist Georg Simmel from The Metropolis and Mental Life of 1903. And in it, she explains that Simmel considers the planned urban environment as a conglomerate of rational calculations, but its citizens engage with it from the position of irrational, dreamlike bewilderment. The urban subject is profoundly alienated from their emotional self. They live in a place that is ripe for uncanny disruptions. And she goes on to observe that whole cities can appear to take on a split identity or double nature, such as those slowly recovering from political turmoil and social unrest. These are cities in transition, struggling to reinvent themselves and stuck in a liminal state between uncertain futures and the haunting memories of former regimes. So 50 years after Simmel's observation, a traumatized society emerging from the Second World War pursued new imaginings of rationale, order, and modernity. Places like Croydon, with its thriving town centre and generous urban grain and green space. Although Croydon suffered relatively little bomb damage during the war, its post-war future was determined by aggressive opportunism. The rampant demolition and rebuilding was a very deliberate and calculated act. Residents excluded from the conversation. Politicians, investors, and financiers reshaped the town. Within a generation, a barely constrained political clique led by Sir James Marshall had captured executive power and legislated to effectively circumvent the planning system. They unilaterally embarked on a demolition and construction spree of bewildering scale. Within a few decades, Croydon became an uncanny place. Excuse me a sec. A building boom for instant commercial profit, herding pedestrians into shopping arcades, subterranean alleyways, and car parks. Humans were reduced to consumers, counted, measured, and managed. And since that moment, its folk have been subjected to an ever-changing, never settled urban landscape which has become simultaneously alienating, yet strangely familiar. It continues today as millions of square feet are consented for demolition and reconstruction. We're left wondering if we can ever navigate our way to new civic frameworks where a categorical imperative informs our decisions about shaping the local relationships between people, place, and finite resource. No doubt we can find the ingenuity to develop co-creative, collaborative urban environments that serve those who use them and need them. We can reset the narrative by redefining the morality of adaptive reuse. Ironically, the same spirit of post-war persistence is evident in Croydon's cohort of activist residents. There's an opportunity to mobilize a vast accumulation of psychological intuition. Inviting the freedom to enter a state of heightened imagination and opportunity. But first, we need to recognize how that culture of demolition was facilitated. We have to ask if we've become inured to anything other than constant flux, questioning why the anticipation of redevelopment habitually assumes demolition, questioning how our community has allowed this expectation to drift into careless policy, particularly towards smaller scale sites away from the town centre. House Europe identify that we're still operating in an old system, born out of the need to rebuild a post-war society, a top-down structure, building a narrow future imagined by a handful of people, but imposed on many. The story of Sir James Marshall is the story of the old system. Is this system tenable? I think the answer to this irresistible question is almost certainly no. But to adapt a new system is the work of a generation. It'll take a shift in cultural frameworks, a shift in perception of social interdependence, a shift in political approach, a shift in financial mechanisms, a shift of moral prerogative. Retuning our local system to prioritize the imperatives of our time. The old system evolved through necessity of its time to house people, to manufacture, to supply, deliver, farm, heal, to rebuild hope and optimism in peacetime. So perhaps the question we should start with should be, what do we need now? How do we transition from the old system of structured, solid modernity to a responsive, liquid modernity? A term coined by sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, an approach to our built environment that adapts efficiently, quickly, and sustainably to serve the needs of contemporary society. We need to be telling stories of a more hopeful Croydon that gifts its energy back to people, place, and planet. Light touch, intricate, robust, and inclusive. And thankfully, we're perhaps starting to see more fluid thinking emerging and flowing into Croydon. One that provides for real needs and demonstrates courageous development choices, to adapt and reuse rather than demolish and rebuild, liquid rather than solid. Now, long after it became famous as the setting for Peep Show, Zodiac House in West Croydon was transformed by the ingenuity of Shed KM and Whitby Wood and facilitated by the development vision of common projects. Perhaps it can be seen as an aspirational paradigm for adaptive reuse. The project transforms a derelict 1960s office into 73 high-quality, adaptable temporary homes that celebrate the building's heritage while addressing the temporary housing crisis. The homes are specified to private standards, offering a high quality of life while remaining readily convertible should housing needs change in the future. Communal spaces facilitate community bonds, while using light touch interventions to modify without major works, saving nearly 4,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions during demolition and avoiding a further 2,600 tonnes that new construction would have generated, the equivalent offset of 120,000 mature trees. The tarmac forecourt transformed into a 1,000 square metre planted park to support urban cooling, biodiversity and community well-being. So what might Croydon of the future feel like? I'm certainly not the first person in history to ask that question, and I'm sure I won't be the last. But what I do know is that projects like Zodiac House remain unusual. The policy positions, even in the current local plan redrafting, do not shift emphasis far from the old bad habits of the past. Retrofit is mentioned only 5 times. A dramatic improvement on the 0 in the current plan, yet there's still no emphasis on the presumption in favour of reuse, nor stringent tests for justifying demolition. So when retrofit and adaptive reuse spark such vibrant conversations in our networks, we still have a long way to go to see meaningful change outside. Yet there are many local, regional and national organisations dedicated to community engagement in the transformation of existing buildings. Are these voices in Croydon today invited into conversations about how their urban landscape is reshaped? We're looking at decades of demolition and construction patterns continuing. Potentially thousands of perfectly useful, adaptable buildings wasted. That's why the ACAN Demolition Map and the Don't Waste Buildings campaign exist, providing resources to promote this simple message. And in Croydon over recent decades, I wonder if the right question's been asked, collaboratively engaging with the interdependent communities that are going to be impacted. Have new patterns of use been explored that aren't defined by the often inadequate viability paradigm? Are there new opportunities which embrace the strength of a relational society rather than the legacy of upheaval and hubris that shaped the town previously? Consider how our built environment acts as the scaffolding of social cohesion. Its familiar continuity creates a sense of safety and belonging, and its patient evolution is the soundtrack of community. Policy and decision-making enacted in the insular chambers of boardrooms and council offices will only serve the interests of those few voices who can pay to be heard. All of these CGI representations are buildings which are consented and may or may not be built. This one actually has been. But their narrative in those boardrooms and meetings suit their needs alone. Public consultation is so often a box to be ticked. What about listening to the real needs of a community and providing systemic solutions? So what's next for St George's House and Seagas House? Derelict for 8 years so far, following the bankruptcy of the Chinese holding company who own it. 2 of just a handful of buildings not earmarked for demolition and reconstruction over the coming decade. And what's next for Luna House and Apollo House? Sold recently to undergo an office to resi conversion. Great news on the demolition front. The largest permitted development conversion of its kind in the United Kingdom. A massive retrofit project which could set new standards for adaptive reuse. As great credit to Studio Egret West for their scheme. The Times' description of the new owner, however, as Britain's meanest landlord, despite not even living in Britain, of course, is hopefully to be taken with a pinch of salt. So what can we learn from Croydon's story? Well, consider how design can serve to minimize dilapidation. Simplifying maintenance might reduce the likelihood of demolition, as we heard in the film. Consider measures that enhance climate resilience. As weather patterns change, buildings remain useful for longer. Campaign to further reduce VAT on renovation and refurbishment. So often the viability loophole. Treat each building as an educational opportunity. Seek to restore pride and agency in people and places. And above all else, value human dignity at every step. So what of Croydon's future? There'll always be some need to demolish buildings and structures where circumstances are right and justified. but we need to seek a unified collective aspiration embedded within policy. Encourage local political leadership to prioritise and collaborate for adaptive reuse of existing buildings. But fundamentally, we should be seeking to re-establish the principle of urban development being done with people rather than to them. Croydon may finally be disrupting the pattern of loss and establishing a pattern of continuity. Time will tell. But I want to leave you with this piece of wisdom from Indy Johar, which struck a chord with me recently whilst preparing these reflections. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Matt. We haven't had very many questions in the chat, but please continue to add them. Yeah, I'll just introduce myself first. I'm Susie Nelson. I'm one of the coordinators of ACAN's existing building group. I'm going to start off with some broad questions, and then there's one or two specific questions that have come up in the chat, but please continue to ask questions in the chat. Matt gave some indication of the broad changes in policy that were needed. I wondered if the other speakers wanted to add anything on what policies need to change to promote the retention of existing buildings. Alice, do you want to start? Or Ava, you're going to start.
I guess I kind of touched on it with the Save Britain's campaign that just closed a few days ago. The way the demolition is approved in Scotland is slightly different than down south, and at the moment you can kind of demolish without need for justification as much as in the rest of England. So I think that's the first and really to look at legislation to make demolition the last resort, to make sure that if a developer wants to demolish, we need to follow some principles and prove that it's completely unavoidable, what Matthew was talking about before as well. If there are, risks related to kind of public health, etc., or if the building is not structurally sound, there are some reasons I guess are justifiable, but generally you should be able to demolish if there isn't enough justification. And the other obvious one is the VAT as well. It was really interesting in the film to see the difference in Europe, but here, if you're building new, that's 0% VAT. If you're refurbishing, it's 20%. So that's another key legislation piece that I think would really influence the opportunities for retrofit. And I'll let Alice come in as well.
Well, I agree with all those policy suggestions that you've both made. What I would say is that it needs a change to the planning policy, national planning policy framework, and that is only going to come through if we get, government to accept that new build is not the answer to the economic problems this country has. They obviously want to generate as much growth as possible through new construction. So it's a political project, I think. And architects and construction professionals need to try and get that message across to people in general, but also we need to ramp up campaigning to just force change to happen, because it's not going to happen by itself, because the government is completely inured to saving existing buildings. They want demolition and rebuilding. It makes money for the economy. So that's a big problem, and I'm not sure what the solution is, I'm afraid.
Matt, did you want to add anything?
Well, no, but it comes down to the fundamental appetite within a political system, locally or nationally, as to how you want to value the existing infrastructure of your society. And in Croydon, I think Tracy's put a funny comment in the chat there. Does Croydon Council have a reverse Midas touch? Well, that's kind of what it looks like, but it really doesn't need to. You can stem the tide of this through smart policy making, but there hasn't really been the political will in Croydon to do that. I think I mentioned in one of our preparation meetings for this that we've got some pretty big local elections coming up, and we might see some dramatic change. So yeah, look, all we can do as practitioners in this space, I think, is to try and lead by example where possible. I tend not to, if something needs to be taken down on a site I'm working on, it's always sort of audited, and it is mentioned as deconstruction, the salvage of materials. And I did actually note in the Uniball Radamco Westfield thing that they have proposed, this is for an enormous redevelopment right in the centre, they have proposed that they're going to open up a sort of reuse hub where materials will be stored, and then local builders, homeowners, whoever can come and purchase or maybe just take away the materials. I mean, that's a long way off, but it shows that those conversations are starting to emerge, even in the big developers' sort of approaches to these things. So yeah, green shoots and all that.
You've all focused on legislation and policy. I wondered what we can do to persuade planners who are dealing with individual schemes. What can we ask planners to do differently in terms of how they evaluate particular proposals?
Well, the problem is they don't really have the national planning policy to back up any attempt to save existing buildings, which is what we saw with Marks and Spencer's. When it came to the planning inquiry, despite best intentions by Michael Gove, it didn't hold water in terms of planning policy. So I think we need a fundamental change of policy to prioritise retention, and that needs to be a major shift. I think it's very difficult for local authorities to do this themselves. You do get some local authorities that are more positive than others, and they may be able to achieve more in terms of saving existing buildings. But my experience of observing development control in Camden is that the consideration of the existing building takes a very low priority against other priorities, such as providing new homes or straightening out the streets or providing, better urban design. These all take priorities over retention of existing buildings time and time again. And that is, I'm not sure how we can get that across to planners. Maybe it does need political pressure from people within those local authority areas to try and raise the profile of the importance of retaining existing buildings. But at the moment, planners just don't seem to understand the basic issues, which is what I was touching on.
The other thing, I guess, to touch on that and what Alice was talking about and what planners can do, for me, what's fundamental is community engagement and getting people involved into all these processes. And this is a statutory requirement in Scotland for any planning application. The planners and the applicants need to go to the public, and you have the right to object. That should be advertised a bit more widely. I think there's definitely a point there. How do we engage? How are these events advertised? How meaningful is engagement at the moment? And if there is a role for the planners to play in that aspect to kind of make this engagement a bit more widely advertised, to make sure that more people can, and more democratically, they can be involved. And because usually and very often these demolitions are associated with local opposition as well. Maybe that's another way to stop those buildings from being lost. So meaningful engagement for me is quite key on that.
Did you want to add anything, Matt?
Yeah, I mentioned about the draft local plan having 5 references to retrofit. I mean, retrofit, we all know what it means, but most people don't know what it means. And I think there's something around communication. So my response to the local plan consultation probably contained more references to retrofit and adaptive reuse than the entire 150 pages of the local plan. Then you look at the list of consultation responses, and there are 200-page documents from big development corporations who are looking to gain a foothold. So, you know, my quiet voice on my own does very little. If we were to mobilize through Croydon Green Network, through Croydon Climate Action, you know, we have a much stronger voice together. And I think just couple of things to bear in mind about the planning system, and I've had my issues with it for decades. Since 2010, the real-time funding of planning departments generally across the country has been cut in half. And that's completely unsustainable. I mean, there was a small uplift, I think, last year in funding, and I'm starting to see a bit of change at the sort of small domestic scale level. But here we're talking about, you know, big infrastructure development essentially, which requires highly intensive time and effort, a skill set that I'm not sure all planning departments are equipped with at the moment. So that's a factor which could really change how these decisions are made.
Ava, there was a specific question in the chat about the change in policy and recent change in policy in Scotland. Do you have a view about the impact of that?
Sorry, can you repeat that question? I haven't seen it.
Sorry, it's I'll read. Sorry, it's moved down. Okay, NPF4, newish national planning policy in Scotland, does move towards retention of existing buildings, of existing assets and previous policy. Definitely feels like a shift in thinking.
Yeah, definitely. I do see positive movement in Scotland, to be honest, and especially after NPF4. There's a lot of conversation around biodiversity enhancement and retaining, and obviously putting retrofit first where possible. The fact that this is an advice rather than it's a guidance at the moment. So there's no legislation to stop a developer from building something new. For example, it could be a requirement to provide, you know, evidence of the whole life carbon assessment of what would the new building can embodied carbon be, and obviously as opposed to maintaining and retaining the existing. So that there is definitely a shift towards you know, retrofitting more and maintaining our buildings more, but at the moment it is guidance, and we don't see that being the legislation yet. But there's definitely positive movement, I guess.
Good to hear. Thank you. There's a question from Tracy Haig about, is there a shortage of retrofit skills? So if we get the policy shift, can it be delivered?
You go, Matthew.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, Tracy, you know the answer. Yes, there is. How do we solve it? I don't know. There's no silver bullet to solving it. I think it's a sort of concerted effort to maintain good information delivery to the general public and to young people, to existing trades, to career changes. I've been into East Kent College in Ashford to go and speak to students and teachers there. They're teaching plumbing and electrics and carpentry, and I'm educating them about educating. That sounds very fancy. I'm giving them more insight into a broader range of materials, natural fibre materials, for example, and they're really keen to learn and understand. On a project last summer, I went and showed a couple of builders who were just doing a small residential project because I'd specified wood fibre insulation. They said, how do we use this stuff? I said, well, first, you don't need the dust mask and the protective gloves, because it's just wood fibre. You just cut it with a saw. And so going in onto site and actually showing and demonstrating, explaining is a very powerful way of doing things. I went to Croydon College last year sometime and just spoke with an hour with a group of students. And I held up a piece of wood fibre insulation, which I've got just there. And I said, does anyone know what this is? And they were guessing all sorts of things. no one guessed it was insulation because they said, well, no, it doesn't look like insulation. And so we do have a sort of fundamental sort of lack of understanding. There's not the breadth of curriculum available. So I have spoken with city and guilds about developing particular natural material curricula that can then be rolled out. How do we deal with the skills? Right now, we do everything we can to demonstrate and lead by example.
Alice or Eva, do you want to come in on the skills question?
I completely agree with Matthew. It's just something I've noticed in my work as well. We work in my office in a lot of existing and heritage buildings that are sometimes in ruins, and we go in and try to repurpose them. And you can see contractors not having the manpower, or you can see like so very specific skills, heritage related and repair skills that are becoming less and less available. So it's definitely something that needs to be addressed as a key issue when we're talking about reusing and retrofit. We need to upscale, and there needs to be investment funneled towards that direction. 100% agree.
It needs sort of investment by government into proper rollout of skills training, because what is being provided at the moment isn't adequate at all. And it also, all construction workers generally get sucked into new build because it's obviously there's a huge demand for new build. So it kind of leaves this sort of the retrofit sector sort of undermanned to a very, very severe degree. We know there's probably about 600,000 retrofit construction workers needed to retrofit all our homes. I think that's something like the number. But just generally, it needs investment in skills training. And I think we have to put pressure on the government to try and do more of what they're doing in the energy sector around retrofit. I mean, they have obviously provided some funding, but it's focused on the sort of domestic and residential side of things, and not on, commercial and business space, which there is a huge amount of. So, it'd be interesting to have a conversation and brainstorm around how one might campaign on that.
I mean, all of the topics that would cause a huge effect, a huge shift in the mindset and how we do our business as usual. Even what Matt was talking about before with the material banks and the circular economy around materials. If we cannot save a building and it is demolished, what do we do with this material? Most of this stone is crushed and used for heritage stone and dress stone. This is insane. And I was trying recently to work on a building and to find buildings at risk and repurpose whole facades to build a new building from old materials and from old buildings, so that at least we keep the memories of these buildings alive and of these materials. And there's no such structure in the UK at the moment. They keep talking about this circular material libraries, but I wonder when that will become a reality. And again, if we're looking at in Europe, these are things that have been delivered. So maybe there's things that we can look at how it was delivered in other cities and how we could make that happen as a kind of pilot project in some of our cities.
Yeah, I just to quickly add on that, the government will fund things where there is clearly a citizen need. I mean, they're politicians, they do things that people want, generally speaking. That's their raison d'etre. So if we can generate the demand within the general homeowner sphere, then they will be asking contractors to make sure that they're putting in the right kind of insulation, for example, and they're driving those sort of retrofit ambitions within the homeowner market, which represents 60% of all the housing stock in the UK. Then that's going to drive a skills escalation, because there will be people wanting to pay money for people with skills.
That I wondered just on, obviously we need to raise the profile of the issue and the damage that demolition does. I wondered if you could offer any top tips for people who are campaigning on retaining particular buildings. Alice, you're in the process of trying to raise the
Yeah,
profile
so
of on Thomas. What do you think what have been your priorities in terms of trying to
I think
raise
the main thing that drove me to get involved with that particular threat to a building was the fact that nobody had been told about it. No one knew that it was a proposal to redevelop it. And I just think that is a failure of local government. You know, if they think they're preparing a plan for the benefit of Euston and they can't engage with people about their proposals, that is a problem. So I think I tend to get motivated by these things that I think are just wrong. But I don't know what the key to a successful campaign is. I think it's sharing information and just informing people of the consequences. I don't have a solution.
I think that what was really useful in your presentation was actually your projections of the scale of the mass of the new buildings. That was very powerful. So I think well, as people with those skills, I think that's a really useful role to play. And anything from Ava or Matt on this issue?
A really difficult question. I was involved in the Windford campaign. The residents actually were driving that, and they just got in touch they contacted different architects and engineers trying to see if, is it reasonable? Is it possible to save the building? So we did kind of some drawings, and some architects drew actually the whole proposal of how it could be saved. And even though the campaign was really strong, the result was almost inevitable. So it's a very difficult question. In terms of how you join campaigns and you find out about campaigns, the only thing I'd say is join your local community council meeting. There's more things that you can influence just by joining some of these meetings if you feel really tired to join at the end of the day. But it is more things are in your power than you think.
Yeah. I mean, it's so difficult to give some sort of blanket answer to the demolition campaign, anti-demolition campaign. Would I go and campaign against the Regina Road estate in Croydon being demolished? I don't think I would, because 83% of the residents who live in those awful conditions and have been subjected to them for many years, there's an emotional scar there, which, well, I don't know. I wasn't involved in the detail of it, but there's an ITV documentary on those buildings, and they are due to be brought down, I think, this year. It really was something. I don't know. Every situation is totally different. The one I opened up with in Folkestone, I mean, you could not make that up, and that's where planning policy and bureaucracy and personnel, you don't know until you get there what you're going to encounter. So you have to adapt your approach, to each circumstance.
But I think the common thread is engaging with the local community is the key thing, isn't it? Whether if the local community don't want to retain the buildings, then there's probably is a case for demolition. But that's probably the rare case.
Yeah.
But a final question is: are you aware of any countries that have better legislation in terms of protecting existing buildings?
I'd just say I think the protections we have for heritage in the UK are pretty strong. From what I know, I'm no expert in it, but yeah, I mean, that's a good place to start in terms of protecting buildings that aren't listed in some way. I'm not familiar, I'm afraid.
This probably this isn't any question we don't necessarily have the answer to. Do you have anything to add, Eva or Alice? We do work with other Architects Climate Action Network has other chapters in Europe, and they also campaign on demolition. But I don't think that, I think it's an issue. I mean, as you saw from the film House Europe, that it's an issue across Europe, certainly demolition. I don't think it's not unique to the UK.
I mean, I think certain countries have got a better reputation for, having a higher bar to justify demolition, such as Belgium. But I don't know the details of it, and it would actually be useful to have some kind of resource where one could just kind of find this information, because I've searched for it a number of times, but I can't actually remember where it was. I think, I think we need to think about how to campaign on these issues more by maybe starting a resource. And also, what about reaching out to the House Europe people? And we're not in the European Union, unfortunately, so that slightly precludes us, but maybe there is a way of working with them. Because I
think that's something we can explore.
Yeah.
Another question's come in about would having mandatory pre-development audits help retention of existing buildings?
That's a kind of another obvious one to say yes, of course, and that's what I was kind of alluding at before. There are tools that we could use in pre-planning. We could calculate whole life carbon by retaining and by building new. There are ways to kind of evidence why and if demolition is the only way forward. But going back to your other question about example countries, like in a case study analysis would be great to have as a tool, and looking what other countries are doing better. I think ultimately our financial systems and what they support is very similar. So I'd be very surprised if development and regeneration are not linked to social clearance or kind of bigger regeneration and carbon-heavy buildings. I know that some of the countries like France and Italy have very strong kind of heritage conservation policies, potentially it's more strict than Scotland, for example. But I've heard about the material library reuse in France that I really want to research a bit more.
But I think time's running out, so it's time to thank people. I'm gonna share my screen. You see that? Well, finally, to thank once again all the speakers, and to all the people who've made this webinar possible, doing the publicity, the graphics, Deepsy for doing the introduction, Leilak for hosting the Zoom, and House Europe for letting us show their film. I just wanted to say, before we close, how you could get involved in supporting the work we're doing around demolition. Just to remind you, you can post details of buildings threatened, demolished and saved on the Demolition Map UK. If you're interested in getting more involved, you could help support the team that managed the Demolition Map, and you could help us in the existing buildings group of Architects Climate Action Network organise future events. We hope that to organise further events around demolition. And finally, if you could think about becoming a member of Architects Climate Action Network. Despite the name, we're not only for architects. We campaign around built environment issues and welcome people from a broad range of backgrounds. You can click on the QR code and that will take you to the joining link. There are various options for joining, or you can look on our website, which is architectscan.org. So thank you all very much for coming. I think it's been a really good. Sorry?
Thank you, Susie.
Thanks, Matt. But I think it's been an inspiring evening, and I hope it will spur lots of you on to further action. So thanks very much.